This is the day that the Lord has made, and we shall rejoice and be glad in it. I'm Reverend J. Stewart Glover, and you are listening to Faith Talk. On this platform, we aim to draw relevancy from the biblical text while bringing clarity to our own religious experience. Now, today, I'm delighted to have Rabbi James Prosnit joining me as a guest today. Rabbi Prosnit, thank you for being here, and how are you today?
I am well, and thank you very much for the honor of speaking to you and your listeners.
Well, thanks so much for coming. Now, Hanukkah has begun, and I thought it would be a great idea to invite Rabbi Prosnit into the room to share with our listening community the history giving rise to this Hanukkah celebration, as well as touching on some contemporary concerns and challenges. But before we get there, Rabbi Prosnit, would you please tell us a little bit about your spiritual journey and the challenges and delights of being a congregational rabbi for 40 years?
Yeah, it's been a long time, but people who knew me way back when would have been surprised at this career path or this calling for me. Obviously, I grew up in a Jewish family, but we were, I guess what you would say, pretty peripheral. I mean, there's an expression in Judaism about being High Holy Day Jews. I guess that's the equivalent of being Christmas and Easter Christians.
Absolutely.
My family would show up on the Jewish high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we would do a few other things during the year. But we were fairly peripheral in my youth. I went to a university in Ohio, which was actually a Methodist college, where there weren't a lot of Jewish students, and it was somewhat the absence of Jewish students that sort of made me begin to think about who I was and what my roots should be. I sometimes attribute my spiritual journey to the Methodist minister on campus, who at one point said to me, "Hey Jim, maybe you should find out a little bit about your own background." I had been dabbling or I'd been interested in civil rights. I was a liberal Jewish kid from the suburbs of New York, and it was a time actually when the Black Power movement was increasing on campus and otherwise in other places, and so it was that roots time period for the women's movement and the African American community, and so this minister took me aside and said, maybe it's time for you to find your own roots. And that was one of those sort of a looking back aha moments where I began to kind of think about that, and as I learned more about Judaism and learned more about the opportunities that the rabbinate would hold for me, it was sort of a no-brainer to move in that direction. After going to the rabbinic school for 5 years and receiving my ordination, I served congregations in Toronto, Canada, Manhattan, New York, and then I settled in Connecticut. I was an associate in those other places and settled in a congregation in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and was there as the senior rabbi of a large congregation for about 30 years.
Amen. Well, I find it interesting that you said the minister at the university, he encouraged you to find out more about your own roots. And I find that amusing as opposed to him trying to convert you to his faith.
Right, yes.
And that's something
true. I think he was very respectful of different people's faiths, and that was the direction he sent me, yes.
Well, amen to that. So Now, let's talk about the historical events that led to the Hanukkah celebration.
Right.
What happened?
Well, if we go back to the 2nd century BCE, as I might call it, BC would be a Christological term, BCE before the Common Era, a more generic term. But the land of Israel then was being occupied by the Syrian Greeks. After Alexander conquered the known world or the Mediterranean basin and established his amazing empire, after his death, the world world sort of divided between the Syrian Greeks and the Egyptian Greeks. And the Syrians were in control of the area at the time, and the leader was one of these. We find this in the book of Maccabees, which I think for Jews and Protestants is part of the Apocrypha. I think for Catholics it's part of the actual Bible or the Old Testament, but for Jews and Protestants we consider it part of the what we would call the apocryphal texts. But in the book of Maccabees it talks about the oppression that the Antiochus, the Syrian Greek ruler, held over the Jews of the day, and deprived them of worshiping in the sanctuaries, deprived them of circumcising their kids and studying Torah. There were a number of Jews, by the way, at that time who were very interested in Greek life. I mean, so it was a part of assimilation. I mean, some Jews were very, drawn to the Greek world of things with the, arts and festivals and gymnasiums and all sorts of things. So it was a little bit of a civil conflict among the Jews as well as connected to the outside world. But things got so bad that a group of ancient priests who were known as the Maccabees, rebelled. And even though it was a small group, they fought a guerrilla warfare. Actually, one of the first recorded guerrilla warfares against the larger Greek army at the time. And they were amazingly successful. And so they were able to, fight off this, larger power. And we had this celebration of the few versus the many. And it was almost like a David and Goliath type of story that lived on in this Maccabee text. After they defeated the Greeks, they went back to the temple where the sacrificial worship was taking place or had been denied them for many, many years with the Greek control, and they purified the temple, they rededicated the temple, and then the legend was told about a single cruse of oil that was part of the eternal flame, and that cruse of oil was only supposed to last one night, but miraculously it burned for 8. I mean, that's probably I don't want to be a spoiler here for any of the any Jews or others who might be listening. That's probably a legend that came about much later. I mean, the miracle to me was the fact that these groups, this small group of priests, wanted to rekindle the flame of Jewish tradition after it had been sort of eclipsed by the power of the Syrian Greek armies and the Syrian Greek leadership of the time. But later on, they told this sort of legend of the little jar of oil. But the historical piece of it goes back and really was a place where Jewish autonomy was reclaimed in the land and lasted for another few hundred years until the Romans came along. And that was sort of the end of that Jewish life at the time in the ancient land of Israel.
Well, you said this in very clear terms, but I don't want people to think that this Greek occupation was a light effort.
Right.
It was very violent and it was ugly. I mean, they brought things into the temple. I understand the gymnasiums and forbidden dietary, swine on
pigs in the temple.
And there's a horrible story in Second Maccabees about 7 brothers and their mother who was arrested. And this story really
Hannah and her 7 sons.
It brings out the ugliness of it all. I mean, the sons were tortured one by one. In front of the mother. I mean, they're talking about the first one, I believe, was put in a frying pan. and so the aggression, the idea was to wipe out, for me, as I'm reading these stories, the idea was to wipe out any form of Judaism from the face of the earth.
Thank you for making me pause and for filling in the gap there. I didn't try to necessarily sanitize it, but I didn't quite go into some of you're actually right, some of the real oppression that took place at that time.
And so it was a horrible period of time, and for some reason some Christian theologies teach that there was years of silence in between the testaments, and this actually happened. I believe this would have happened in between those so-called silent years.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. This is, I mean, yeah, I think you're probably right. This was because pretty much the Old Testament had been sort of sealed by this time. Maybe there were a few books that were still not part of what we would call the canon. But this happened at very. You're right in that sort of intertestamental period.
So when somebody uses the term, the words, the phrase, the Hellenization of the Jew, what would that mean to you?
Well, it would mean that there was as I was sort of saying, that the Jews who were very attracted to the Greek life. I mean, it was probably had an appeal to them, to some of them, and some of them may have been actually, part of the more affluent, more upper crust part of Jewish society of the day. They were very drawn to all the things that the Greek world was presenting to them, and this group of priests who became known as the Maccabees, were the purists. They were the ones who kind of maintained the flame of tradition at a time when other people were kind of being lured away from their Jewish roots.
I love that term, the flame of tradition.
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, there are, as we move the story to contemporary times, I mean, there is a discussion to be made. I mean, I'm not comparing the world we live in now to the horrific times of Antiochus and the Syrian Greek control, but there is that lure of secularism into our world these days that is a challenge to both the Jewish community and the Christian community, to be sure.
Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But let's talk about the central traditions, the foods, and the activities that occur during this Hanukkah. Well, first of all, let's get to the lights, the candles.
Yeah. So the idea being that when that sort of miracle story was emerged, and I guess actually one of my thinking about that is, why did this legend of the triumph of a little jar of oil sort of prevail in terms of, I mean, if you were to ask most Jews these days, why do we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 nights? Most of them would sort of say because the oil in that one cruise lasted for 8 days miraculously. There was probably other explanations for it, but it's sort of a nice message that we increase the light, and so therefore the essence of Hanukkah these days, from a spiritual point of view, is to light a candelabra called the menorah, and each night we have one sort of lighting candle, and then we add one candle per night. Actually, Reverend, there's an interesting little discussion that took place among the rabbis a couple thousand years ago, which was, how do you light a Hanukkah menorah? How do you light this Hanukkah? And one school of thought said you should start with 8 nights, eight candles burning, and sort of like count down 8, 7, 6, 5, till there was only one light left. And another school of thought said start with 1 candle and add an additional candle every night for the 8 nights. If you've ever seen a menorah lit, you know which side won. It was the adding light that won. And I think there's a message too. We always want to try to increase the light in our communities. And so we add a candle each night. And so tonight, I'm not sure when people will be listening to this, but so each night we add a particular candle to it. So it's a lovely festival. I mean, I'll talk maybe a little bit later about the fact that it's not one of the peak festivals in the Jewish year. So sometimes I'm critical of people who make Hanukkah into like the Jewish Christmas or something along those lines, because it's still a minor holiday, minor festival. But I think at one period of time, people wanted to see God in the miracle. So it didn't want to just be a military victory of the Maccabees. They needed to see some kind of divine hand in it. So that story of the triumph of light and God's role in enabling that cruise of oil to last all the time sort of became a marker of the tradition. because of the oil, we have special foods that are cooked in oil. So potato latkes, potato pancakes are one of the foods that we eat. Jelly donuts are one of the foods that we eat. Where Jews lived in Poland, a lot of pancakes, a lot of potatoes. When Jews lived in the Middle East and other places like that, more jelly donuts and things of that kind. But it's a lovely festival where people gather, with their families and they light the lights and sing some songs. The songs of Hanukkah are not as special or memorable as the Christmas carols of the season, but we try to do our best. And basically, I think for both Jews and Christians at this time of year, what we've got is a winter solstice festival where we sort of acknowledge that at this darkest time of year, how wonderful it is to light candles and to spread the light. And one of the messages, I guess, of a candle is, as long as my candle burns, I can light hundreds of other candles. Even if it's a little tiny stub, I can still light other candles. So it's a nice thing for, people who are aging too, that even, when your candle is kind of like getting smaller and smaller, it's still, the light is just as powerful as it was when it was standing up tall. So there are a lot of nice little messages that come with the holiday.
Amen. Now, the games.
Yeah.
There's one in particular
called the dreidel.
Right.
Now the dreidel is a little top. It probably, in its origins, was somewhat of a gambling game. People anteed up, and then if you fell on a certain letter, you got the pot. If you fell on another, you got the half of the pot. If you fell on another, you had to put into the pot. It's a nice little tradition. Probably has, I haven't heard of really any theological or religious meaning to it, but it's just another one of those customs of the season. Actually, on the dreidel are 4 Hebrew letters, which stand for, if you are here in where I'm living, if you're in the States, it says Nes Gadol Haya Sham. A great miracle happened there. But if you happen to be in the Holy Land, you can buy a great dreidel that says Nes Gadol Haya Po. A great miracle happened here. So those of us who live in the States sort of reflect a great miracle happened there. And of course, the miracle was the triumph of this, of faith over darkness, of light over darkness.
So over time now, I would imagine, and I might be wrong, I would imagine that in the beginning, or when the celebration of Hanukkah was in its early stages of development, that there was probably some teaching around the events that led to the celebration. Is that something
Correct.
That's continued today?
Well, here we're going to get into our secularization conversation, I think, because I think some of that teaching, yes, the answer to your question is yes, it should be centerpiece, but unfortunately in many homes, it's the lighting of the menorah and it's, can we get to the presents now?
Right. Can I have another donut?
Yeah, can I have another donut? Can I have another donut? Can I get the presents? I think, this is an example of the merging of, or the taking over. The Christmas season has sort of gotten connected to the Jewish season of Hanukkah.
Right, the practice.
And here we're talking about the material culture that I think we're all facing. Right. Hanukkah is as I said earlier, is a bit of a minor Jewish holiday. It's a lovely holiday. If we were to talk to if my grandfather was around and I said, Grandpa, how do they celebrate Hanukkah in your day? He would probably say, we lit a menorah, we had some potato pancakes, maybe I got some chocolate, as a gift from, my grandfather, and that was it. These days, if I go into the religious school at my synagogue and I ask children, what's your favorite holiday? Most of them will say Hanukkah.
Right.
And the reason for that, of course, is that Jewish families have gotten used to giving presents on this particular day. And why do we give presents on this particular day, Jay? Because our Christian friends give presents on Christmas. And Jewish parents didn't want their children to feel badly and say, oh, can't we, Mom and Dad, I think I'd rather be Christmas than Hanukkah.
Right.
Because my friends are getting presents.
Right.
So here we're dealing with a little bit of secularization and material culture and the influences. So we've kind of, so it's the put the light back in Hanukkah, put the Christ back in Christmas. Sometimes we squander our sacred events and we turn them into something pretty secular.
Well, I noticed that around this time of year, Christmas, when I was a little boy, I used to write down a couple of things on a piece of paper that I wanted. And now technology has changed, so my grandson sends me links to Amazon of what he wants.
Nothing wrong with gift giving.
Oh no.
Yeah, I don't want to say there's anything wrong with gift giving, right. But I think we would probably all agree that sometimes, some families take this, to the extreme.
Absolutely. And on the, we talked a little bit about mentioning the challenges of being religious leaders at a time of increased secularization. I think that there is a notable trend towards the abandonment of religion and religious practices. As a matter of fact, this word tradition is often frowned upon by younger generations and some older folk. And now, of course, there are some traditional practices that should be revisited.
Right.
And however, but we must understand that it is through our tradition that the language of our faith is preserved from generation to generation. So absolutely. I love the phrase you use, the flame of tradition, because I find that some people are looking for something new, and to discard tradition and treat it as though it's a bad word.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree more with that. And sometimes, when I look at, our year, some people's year are marked by here I'm reflecting on my interest in sports, but you're dealing with we go from the World Series to the Super Bowl to the NCAA college tournament to something else. I mean, people's world revolves around sports. Whereas if we were enabled people for worlds to revolve around some of these wonderful, faith traditions, there'd be so many more opportunities for us to, gather as families, to gather as, with other people who care about some of the same values and messages that we care about. I mean, if we marked our year with, harvest festivals and dark time of year festivals and springtime festivals that all faith traditions have, I think we would really, be able to mark that year in a much more sacred formulation and understand, God's role in so much of our lives and so much of our, not only the life passage, but also the seasonal flow.
And I think doing that would also stand against those who are saying that some traditional practices are not necessary. You have some that argue that the scriptural stories are not true, and therefore why teach them? And what would you say to that? The people who argue, that's not true.
Yeah. Well, here's the classic example. What I was suggesting before is I'm not sure if that little jar of oil miracle story is true. Okay? And by the way, there are plenty of Jews who believe it's true, and far be it for me to come along, as a more modern rabbi and say it's not. But to me, that's not the question we should be asking. We shouldn't be asking, is it true? We should be asking, what are the truths of the story? Sometimes when I teach my students, I sort of say to them, okay, I'm not gonna. I have a hard time with some miracles too. I'm not sure my rational brain could ever say that snakes ever talked, to Adam and Eve. I'm not. My faith is strong, but at the same time, I question certain things from the biblical tradition. But the focus isn't, is this true? Did it happen? The question is, what are the truths of this particular story. And what a wonderful truth it is that some group of Jews in ancient days wanted to repurify the sacred temple that had been desecrated. And they found one little jar of oil. And they decided, you know what? Let's just go for it. We don't know how long this thing's going to last. But we're gonna commit ourselves, and we're gonna light it and see how long it possibly lasts until we have a chance to make some more. And miracle of miracles, that little effort to light the spark, to kindle the flame that they chose to do, speaks of volumes in terms of the darkness that sometimes we find in our world today. So was it true that it happened? I don't care. But what are the truths? Wow. What an amazing story that is.
Amen, amen. And so also today we're finding that as young people and some intellectuals, religious intellectuals, try to throw away tradition and discount the truth of even the underlying truths in these stories, what does that leave us with? That leaves us with a life that is devoid of faith. Where faith is no longer needed. And where does that leave you? That leaves you where trying to live a life that's pleasing to God takes a back seat to consumerism and your political ideology and sports fanaticism or whatever. But I can't imagine me trying to live my life outside of being in a right relationship with God.
Yeah, I mean, someone once said, "Faith is the willingness to believe despite uncertainty." And I'm, like you, I'm willing to believe despite the uncertainties.
Well, I think that one of the things I really like to do is to have these conversations, because I think that we can dismantle some of the harmful stereotypes that are being suggested and acted on, and to leading to hate language and acts of hate. I think by having these kind of conversations, we can kind of explore the commonalities and embrace the commonalities instead of demonizing our differences. Now, I don't feel the need.
Amen to that, by the way.
Yeah, I don't feel the need to try to convert you from being a faithful Jewish person to embracing what I believe. I think we can learn from each other, and the goal of interfaith dialogue is not to create a new religion where everybody, come one, come all. No, it's good to have your faith tradition, right? But what we can do is embrace the full humanity of the religious other, the ethnic other, and celebrate the presence of God in the life of this other person, as opposed to demonizing our differences. Now, so in today's contemporary, and I guess this is nothing new, but there's an uptick in the anti-Semitism, right? Yeah. There's an uptick there, and I tell you, I don't understand the origins of it.
Yeah, it's sad actually that there has been, and I have to agree with you, I think anti-Semitism is one of those things that's, the Jews realize has always been here. It's sort of like, someone once likened it to a virus. It kind of never completely goes away. Sometimes it lies dormant, and then all of a sudden something happens within our society, and it sort of like comes back again. So I think that's a little bit of what's happened lately. I know this is a religiously focused podcast, so I don't want to get political or overly political with you. But I think, some of the restraints of the last, 4 years or so, have taken off some of the guide rails. There have always been anti-Semites. There have always been people who have thought Jews had more power than I think Jews know we have. They think, and there have been, but in recent years, some of these fringe elements have been made more, acceptable to say things that are hurtful and problematic, and I think that's been unleashed in our society, and we see the lingering input of that. Because I think, some in our world think that, what did they say in Charlottesville? Jews will not replace us. What did that mean? That meant that, we, are the white privilege of certain people. I mean, whether it's African Americans or Jews or immigrants or whatever, shouldn't replace who's who in American society. So I don't want to drift too far into the politics, but I think sometimes it has to be called out. And the challenge for the Jewish community, of course, is you can't ignore it, but you have to call it out. But at the same time, when you call it out, you sometimes run the risk of, making other people. I'm thinking a little bit of the Kanye West and Kyrie Irving stuff that's come up in recent days. I mean, how do we handle that? Should we, probably the best way to handle it is through education.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think that hate heals through furthering hate language. Mm-hmm. And I think that the throwing out of these harmful stereotypes that we're hearing, whether or not it's black people are criminals or Mexicans coming across the border are criminals and rapists, or all Jews are rich Hollywood producers or landlords. When a person hears that language, they should leave. They should close their.
Go ahead.
They should close their heart to that.
Right, and they should try to get to know somebody and they should try to get to know somebody in that other category, because when you get to know somebody in that other category and build relationships, like I'm blessed to say you and I have done over the late years, all of a sudden, those stereotypical views kind of begin to melt away significantly. We sometimes live in our own little bubbles, and if we ever got out of our bubbles to meet somebody who's not like us, I think we would find in most instances that the same quests and the same desires are part of everyone, part of all.
Mm-hmm. So, again, I don't want to go too far into this, but it's a dreadful cancer that's in our society today. And, if you have a bad relationship with somebody or a few people, you can't paint all the people with that by that experience. If I was to get mugged by a Chinese person, I can't say that all Chinese people are muggers.
Right.
And it boils down to it's that simple. But it's a condition of the heart that feels the need to demonize someone else in order to make yourself feel a little bit better about yourself, who you are. And it's a sad situation.
That's a little statement about human nature too, which is problematic. But I think you're right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we've kind of covered it, and I want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming on. This initiative is going to be up by tonight.
Okay.
Up on Apple, iTunes, and iHeartRadio, and some of the other Amazon, Audible, and all of those podcast platforms. It's going to be out there, and I'll send you the link.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and it's so nice to have a chance to talk to you and through you to your listeners, and I get to wish people a very Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah and a season and a dark season of light and renewal. That's really the primary wish at this winter solstice time of year.
Well, you've been listening to Faith Talk, and I certainly thank you for being part of our listening community. I want to thank the Rabbi Jim Prosnit for coming in and contributing so richly to this conversation. And I'm sure that my prayer is that I hope somebody from somewhere around the world would hear something that's been said that encourages hope and strength for today, hope for a brighter tomorrow. Rabbi, thank you for coming on. May God continue to bless you and prosper you, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.